So thank you everybody for joining. My name's Jo. I work for LexisNexis Risk Solutions, which is part of the RELX group. I've worked for the company for just under 13 years. And in my current role, leading people, culture and belonging, which effectively is our diversity work, our sustainability and environmental work, well-being, early careers and volunteering and CSR strategy. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion, how that world is shaping. I'll touch a bit on well-being and AI. I'll caveat, these are massive topics, and for topics that I could talk for hours on, I have a few slides. So please think of this as an overview and a sort of whistle-stop tour of all things diversity, equity and inclusion. Please also put anything in the chat. Hopefully we'll have some time to get to any questions at the end. So I thought I would start off really thinking back. I've worked in diversity for about 6 years on some of the phrases, or sometimes even called the Joisms, that I like to use in this role, because they've really helped me kind of talk in a way that engages people and people really understand what we're trying to achieve in this space. So inclusion shouldn't exclude. If you don't intentionally include, you will unintentionally exclude. What gets measured gets managed or gets done. Nothing about me without me. If we're all thinking the same, we're not thinking enough. Unity, not uniform. Build it in, don't bolt it on. And baby steps are still steps forward. So hopefully as I go through the presentation, kind of why I have sort of grabbed onto some of these phrases and used them in this work will become really clear, because diversity and equity and inclusion work, it's not easy. It's sadly not always linear. You have to try things out. You have to be willing to experiment. I don't go at the pace in my organization as my enthusiasm and passion for the topic would let me. And, you know, sometimes you get setbacks, but you've always got to keep moving forward and making progress. So the world of DI has changed a lot. If I think to my time in the work, here's just some of the areas where I feel dialogue's really shifted. So DI work historically used to talk about equality, right? Everybody's the same, everybody needs the same things. The law is typically cemented in equal rights, equal opportunities. But we know it's much more nuanced than that. It's really about equity. We don't all need the same things. What is appearing equal for some may actually be excluding others. And actually diversity, equity work, or equity and inclusion work, really focuses on the sense that giving everybody the same doesn't necessarily mean you're being more inclusive. It's really understanding individuals' needs and having that equity mindset, i.e. we give people what they individually need to be successful. And that could really vary by individuals, sometimes by different demographic groups. Accommodations to moving to a far more disability or accessibility positive conversation, where actually we don't sort of talk about accommodations as such. It has some negative criteria that you need to be accommodated if you have a disability, to actually saying, how can we make everything more accessible to people, which actually takes a really sort of collective view that we all have different accessibility needs. And actually people with disabilities or people who are neurodivergent, this is about giving accessibility. So the workplace is accessible and inclusive. DI work, in fact, when I started in this work, we used to talk a lot about gender, race or ethnicity. Now we've really evolved the thinking, because we know, of course, you know, women, ethnicity groups are not big monoliths of the same. There are commonalities of experience. There are similar equity barriers that certain groups may experience that other groups may not. But actually we're all different. And I always feel that inclusion work serves best when we sort of notice the barriers and the commonality, but we also recognize the individuals and the intersectional nature of our work, because we are no one thing. No person is diverse and another person is non-diverse, or some people are more diverse than others. We really just work in a space where we're all individuals, and actually we have many different dimensions to what makes us up. But of course, there's that intersectional nature of different characteristics, bringing different experiences people may have in the workforce. Representation. I'll talk a little bit about D&I fatigue later, but if you think of how there's been a real dramatic change, particularly in the US. You could argue it goes very down a representation route, right? The law requires you, or did require you, to take action where there were gaps in representation. And whilst I can appreciate there's good sentiment behind that, the challenge is if you just look at representation and you ignore culture, you tend to make decisions firstly based on demographics being diverse, not everybody being diverse. And secondly, improving representation from a demographic perspective, whether that's gender, ethnicity, or any other characteristic, is really not very valuable unless you have a culture that's fully inclusive and welcoming of all different ideas and perspectives. So that dialogue's really changed. And I think best practice in D&I and the companies that have kept their commitments around DI really do look at it through a cultural lens. How can we be more inclusive for everybody? And representation, improvement in visible demographic representation comes as a result of that positive culture and practices, not doing the same things, as I say, but expecting different outcomes or trying to manage the outcome differently to the same process, because ultimately that creates perceptions of unfairness. Activism to just generally being allies or having a good sense of allyship. Activism is sort of seen as disruptive, whereas being a good ally is generally just a good practice. How can we be supportive of each other? Strong leadership. One of the common questions I ask my leaders is, how has leadership changed in the last decade? And they almost always talk about the need for empathy, matrix management, globalization, psychological safety, a topic I'll talk more on, actually, that need to create cultures where people can share their perspectives, can speak out, can be psychologically safe. And then lastly, the moral case versus the business case, which I'll move on to. But originally, D&I was very framed as it's morally the right thing to do. This is just my personal view, but I don't like that argument at all. There is really strong, legitimate business case to investing in diversity and equity and inclusion. It's not moral. And when you put it in a moral case, you're almost sort of putting people in victim mode, that we are morally saving people and giving them opportunity sort of out of goodwill. But actually, that's completely untrue. We need to be doing this because there's such a strong business case. So that absolutely brings me on to my next point around the business case. Now, as I said, this is one slide, but I could have presented 30 on this. But companies that really invest in diversity and inclusion and belonging do show really strong business impact. That is still the case today. There was research in 2013 by the Harvard Business Review that looked at some of the dynamics of representation and inclusion in culture and how does that align to business metrics. And what they found then was inclusive companies or inclusive cultures in companies were far more likely to be innovative, nearly 2 times more innovative, and that was giving real advantage on market leading or being first to market. Companies with much stronger representation for ethnicity were more likely to outperform competitors, and inclusive teams were making much better decisions over time. Now, that's 3 metrics. I'm summarizing a lot of research in 3 key data points. Anybody who knows me knows I love data. But what I'd really like to say is the Harvard Business Review have continued to keep that research going. They continue to revisit that research. And every single time they do that, the strengthening of the case is really apparent. It just becomes more evident that diversity, and critically with an inclusive culture, really strengthens so many business outcomes. We could extend that into what do candidates look for when they're looking to join companies. Even investors will look at diversity, sustainability of companies when making investing decisions. So, and I think where we think about the sort of fatigue around D&I always come back to strengthening that business rationale and business case. And there is a lot more research. I'm just sort of summarizing the Harvard Business Review because it was really pioneering and perhaps the strongest case that was made. But of course, as I said, diversity is irrelevant if you don't have an inclusive culture. And I always think of inclusive cultures as an ecosystem, right? There's no one thing that you should do, and everything sort of impacts each other. So if you change one aspect of an ecosystem, then actually other areas of inclusion tend to be impacted as well. But here's my view on 5 things that I think make up a really strong inclusive culture. So unconscious bias and bias mitigation in our processes. I'll talk to that next. There is no cure for bias. It's how our brains are wired. But actually noticing bias is really important to making culture and processes really fair and equitable. Investing in the health of our workforce. So by that, I mean our well-being. Actually, the case for that's never been stronger. Well-being used to sit as this nice thing to do for enthusiasts around their health and well-being. But actually, our well-being is so impacted by culture. Culture is good for our well-being, and well-being is good for our culture. It really affects how we perform. And I think companies are much wiser to how we all perform better when we can notice our well-being, when we can take breaks, when we realize that we're not going to be high performing 8 to 9 hours a day. We have bursts in our energy and our performance, and how we can really take advantage of working with our well-being. Psychological safety, and I'm conscious that a lot of people on this call come from a health and safety background as well. So I thought it was really relevant to link that to cultures where people speak up. We know cultures where people are afraid to speak out, whistle blow, challenge how we do things, have a different view to leadership, that actually can become quite a negative and toxic culture, and there can be quite significant consequences of that. Inclusive leadership behaviours. Like I said, we don't manage through hierarchy anymore. We don't really manage through impact and gravitas and behaviours that are sort of more traditionally thought of as a good leader. Good leadership today and tomorrow, and in a world of AI, will absolutely be much more about how we empathise, how we actively include people. And then lastly, how we create a sense of belonging. Belonging's become a bit more of a buzzword in the D&I world, particularly as companies have looked for different strategies to talk about this work. For me, belonging's quite individual, but belonging's that real connection with the company's mission and purpose, finding real impact and meaning in our work, something that us as human beings really find important, which again, you could link back to our well-being too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about unconscious bias. People may be very familiar with this. Some people don't like unconscious bias and talking about it in D&I spheres. I actually think unconscious bias awareness is really important. But if it's the only thing you do around D&I, it will actually arguably have little to even a negative impact. So we saw a lot of companies invest heavily in unconscious bias training, but not change their processes or practices, or not do anything further around DEI. And I would argue that has a negative effect, because it suggests that a very complicated, layered ecosystem of inclusion is fixed by one thing. Typically, when people go on training, they either retain the knowledge for a couple of weeks and sharply decline. Even worse, they think that they know how to do this, and actually they just relax back into old behavior, which can be very biased. So unconscious bias, effectively, it refers to that automatic decision making that we make. And we make it a lot because ultimately our brains, and we have survived because we've been very good at sensing danger and reacting to danger. Our brains are ultimately wired to perceive danger. Really important when you have to run away from saber-toothed tigers or anything that's going to eat us. Less important today in that respect, but we still have a brain that's been wired and evolved this way. We just sense danger or perceive danger to be different things. So, for example, the media might sort of portray stereotypes about certain people, which may be completely untrue. But these little sort of shortcuts in our brain very much build over time. And in time, they can become biases. And one of our biggest biases is we tend to like people that are familiar, similar to ourselves, think the same. But we know all the benefits of inclusion go the other way when we talk to people who think differently, who challenge us, have a different lived experience or perspective. And so the best thing to do for unconscious bias is to be aware of it, because we won't change how our brains are programmed. But what we can do is really think about how do we mitigate bias. And we can mitigate bias in a few ways. Firstly, processes that are clear and transparent. I hate anything that's vague, judgment-based, particularly if we think of interviews. People say, oh, I just go on gut instinct, or I'll know very quickly if somebody has what they need to do to be successful in this role, if they're a culture fit. These things are really unclear and ambiguous. So any process, and it doesn't just have to be recruitment, it could be pay decisions, it could be who we choose to put in certain projects, needs to be clearly defined and have good, clear, objective assessment. Checking in with other people. We usually check in with people who think very similarly or we have good relationships with. But actually we get the most value for getting a different perspective, but we rarely do it. Our networks tend to just reflect people that are similar to us, whether that's age, gender, profession, geography. And so we don't necessarily see those blind spots. Equally, we can slow down our thinking. Bias occurs because we like to make quick decisions. So we rely on all those instincts, all those shortcuts our brain has established, connecting people, connecting our own gut instinct, having an elevated view that our judgment's really good. Lots of people tend to think that they have really good judgment. Actually, pretty much all of us as human beings have pretty bad retention of knowledge and judgment and decision making. Expanding out our network, as I mentioned. So if we're all thinking the same, we're not thinking enough is a phrase I like. And then bias checking. Bring it in collectively. It's never really a good idea to walk up to somebody and say, hey, I think you're really biased. But one thing we can all do in a team dynamic, for example, say, have we missed anything? Is there anything we're not noticing? Notice our sort of similarities in how we think and have that as a sense check to say, is there something else we should be thinking about? Is there something we might have missed? Okay, apologies, my slide doesn't seem to move. Okay, I think it's done that. Hopefully that's okay. If it doesn't, please shout. So the next area I want to talk about is how we invest in well-being. And some companies are calling this the immune system of your business. Well-being is so critically important, and actually employee well-being can be really linked to business outcomes, almost in the same way inclusion can be really linked to positive business outcomes of better team dynamics, better employee retention, better decision-making, creativity. I think it would be fair to say the world is a lot more volatile. We know economic shocks have happened. In fact, many of them have happened in halfway through this decade already. But actually, companies that really invest in their employee resilience, in our ability to have strong well-being, resilience, different thinking, energy, performance, that will become a real factor in business success. There's usually a good performance dividend or product dividend for having strong employee well-being programs. Research suggests about 80% productivity dividend if your employees have really good sense of well-being. Of course, a reduction in absenteeism and burnout, because we know when our well-being is not good. And this can really link to inclusion work, because if we feel excluded, if we have to mask or pretend that we're something we're not, if there's something going on in our lives, we haven't got a colleague or a friend we can talk to, then we just keep masking and ultimately we burn out, because it's so challenging to keep being somebody you are not, or to navigate a culture or processes that aren't really designed or built for you. And we really see this particularly in people who have a non-visible disability, some people who are neurodivergent, when they feel they can't be open about their accommodations, their need, their conditions, when they can't ask for help, it can really affect well-being and burnouts. But those wouldn't be the only examples. That would extend out to any moments. I'm sure we have different versions of ourselves, levels of comfort and openness when we go through our working day, people we talk to where we feel very safe and open with, people that we talk to where we have to be an elevated or a different version of ourselves. And I'm sure you'll notice that you actually feel a lot more stressed in those environments and in environments where you can be open and inclusive. Research about wellbeing programs shows a really strong and compelling argument for the sort of return or the dividend on this. So for every £1 invested in wellbeing programs, research shows that there's nearly a sort of 5 times return on that investment in terms of productivity, engagement, employee retention and reduction in absence. And of course, employees with good well-being are much more likely to stay in companies. They're much more likely to be focused, have energy, And of course, all of that translates into really sustained long-term positive goals and performance for the business. I'm going to move on to psychological safety. A lot of people have heard of psychological safety, but obviously some people haven't. So really quickly, if you've not heard of this term, I've got a quote from Simon Sinek, who's a real thought leader in this area. So he says, it's leaders' responsibility to create an environment in which their teams feel psychologically safe. In other words, they're willing to admit they're struggling or made mistakes because they know someone will be there to support them. So that's a really good example of psychological safety in action. I'm sure we've all made mistakes in our career at some point. Sometimes somebody's been really forgiving. We've probably experienced times when people haven't. And actually, depending on the reaction of making mistakes, how easy it is to call things out, to challenge each other, really affects how psychologically safe we are. There's other terms, particularly around Amy Edmondson, who pioneered this work, who talked about it's that feeling of being able to speak out without fear of blame or repercussion, or that you'll be humiliated for speaking out or challenging the status quo. Very brief definition is it's felt permission for candor. But it's really that internal feeling. How willing would we feel to challenge, speak out, or share our perspective? And the reason why it's so important is psychological safety is almost the number one defining thing that makes teams successful. Google did a lot of research on this, spent millions of dollars trying to find out what made teams successful at Google. And the number one thing they found was psychological safety. There are other things that are really important, such as dependability. As I said, in a very uncertain world, we generally gravitate towards safety and dependability as a human need. That in turn, around structure and clarity, we've probably worked in environments where it's very clear, everybody's very clear on what's needed, focused on task. Other environments where people tend to feel a lot less secure when we don't know what we're trying to achieve, or the direction or the change or the dynamic keeps changing. We like to find meaning and impact of our work. So people who have purpose in their life generally feel a lot happier at work. Typically, people with purpose in their life tend to live longer as well. If you want a quick life longevity tip, make sure you find purpose and meaning, either in work or outside of work. But all these things factor through into what makes teams really successful. And as I said, psychological safety tends to be the number one factor. In recent research, 89% of people said psychological safety in the workplace is absolutely essential for performance. So creating psychological safety, it's not a quick fix. This is another area I could do lots and lots of slides on, but just some quick tips around how do you create good psychological safety in your team. Firstly, focus on learning from mistakes. The worst thing we can do is blame people, is say who's sort of on the hook for this, how do we find out what's happened and what's gone wrong, and we see it in a really negative light. Encourage experimentation, particularly around innovation. You don't innovate on the first go. Innovation is an iterative process of learning, failing, and moving forward. Demonstrate curiosity, particularly in leaders, rather than sort of leading with a no or that won't work. Use curiosity as a way to really galvanize ideas and perspective. Acknowledge your own fallibility or vulnerability. The best way you can signal psychological safety in a team is your willingness to be vulnerable yourself. Your willingness to say, I don't understand this. Could somebody please explain it to me? Or could somebody help me understand this a bit better? Or, I've done this before. I've made a mistake before. Anything that demonstrates your willingness to signal vulnerability to a team. Embracing that discomfort, it really enables people to lean in to saying, we don't have all the answers. We might not find that out today, but we're committed to finding solutions, even if we make mistakes along the way. Set it, but don't forget it. Psychological safety can be really broken if people change the dynamics, change the comfort and the rules in the team. Say they'll do something, but actually do something completely different or even undermine people. And of course, builds team values. What do you stand for as a team? What do we all connect with? It's really surprising how little people know each other that they work with every day and their values. I often find most conflict at work really comes from people not knowing each other's values, because our values dictate our thinking and our behaviours. And when we know each other's values, when we know what we stand for, we're much more contracted and aligned to how we work together. And of course, as I mentioned, psychological safety, the reason why so many people think it's so critical is it has so many different impacts. There are more than these, but here are some of the key areas psychological safety can really benefit an organisation. Firstly, innovation. You're never going to innovate if people won't share their ideas, or if their best ideas stay in their head, but they never feel safe enough to contribute. Teamwork and decision making. In the early work Amy Edmondson did around psychological safety, actually teams made more mistakes, but they actually made fewer significant mistakes. She was looking particularly in a medical setting. So as you can appreciate, if people don't speak out and there's a big medical mistake or somebody's missed something, that can have really significant repercussions. Failing forward. So actually, if we make mistakes, if we fail, if something goes wrong, as inevitably it does at work, we just fail forward. We understand what went wrong and we correct it for next time. Speak out cultures. As I said, I'm sure in the context of health and safety, that is deeply reliant on people feeling able to speak out, challenge, notice things, and have a route to talk to somebody or speak out if they're concerned about anything. And then, of course, stronger well-being. When we don't feel included, our bodies respond in exactly the same way as they do to physical pain. So this is more from my work within LexisNexis. What we really want to do is create a positive employee experience and that culture of belonging, as I mentioned. A lot of companies are using the word belonging now, but I don't think as many companies are really thinking about what does belonging mean. It's just become the new buzzword, if you like, in this space. So in our business, we really try and connect the dots, because inclusion is really beneficial to our mental health and well-being. Equity barriers can really exclude certain groups, particularly when we look at factors such as the impact of menopause, mental health. It's really quite surprising how few companies talk about this, have support for employees, and yet half your population will go through menopause. Increasing numbers of people are willing and open and need support around their mental health. Just 2 examples, there are many more. Learning empathy through volunteering. So actually the best way to learn empathy, it's a question I get asked a lot. Can you really learn empathy? Isn't it something that's just you either have it or you don't? But actually through our volunteering, giving back, CSR approach, it's the best way you can learn to be empathetic, because you suddenly see the world from a different perspective. Our work around sustainability and climate change, we particularly feel that gives our organisation purpose, and especially with younger generations, it's really important that we act and behave in a sustainable way. Giving back, so we like the concept of let's make it easier for the next generation. The work we do today is sowing the seeds for future generations. And then lastly, how we use early careers to really enhance social mobility, to give opportunities to the next generation. So, whilst I take a quick sip, the next part of my presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about the future and the future of work. Of course, it's very hard to predict the future, and just over 5 years into a new decade, I'm sure we can all resonate that lots of things have changed already, and this has definitely been a changeable and turbulent decade. But number one, I think very sadly, it's quite common practice or quite common awareness that there has been some D&I fatigue. We have seen companies roll back on their DEI commitments. We have seen companies sort of quietly quitting D&I, certainly in the last sort of 18 months. Here's my thoughts on why that's happened, and also why there's some opportunity here. So economic uncertainty, as we know, we're in a sort of slow growth, maybe arguably recession era globally. There were a lot of elections in 2024. There were more elections in 2024 than there have been in any other year in recent history. So we know under those circumstances, companies tend to respond by cutting back, looking at short-term actions, thinking about how can we cut costs when there's uncertainty. When there's elections, when there's uncertainty, companies don't really want to invest and think longer term. DI work is very much a longer term work and investment. It takes time. We saw a huge resurgence of D&I work in 2020 during COVID and after the murder of George Floyd. But actually, the reality is D&I work is forever. It's part of culture. It continues to evolve. Even the practices you would have put in place in 2020, which would have been considered really good practices, may not be the things you would do in 2026. But anything that takes time causes frustration. We know, particularly in senior leadership, and CEOs, they like quick things, they like to see quick ROI, and D&I is a really challenging one to say you get a return on your investment in a 12-month period. Of course, it can be polarizing. I think it's fair to say the political landscape feels very divided at the moment. There's a rise in polarization of DEI, it being sort of blamed for unfairness, which, of course, I work in this space. I say actually D&I brings you fairness. It's the opposite. But you have to hear all perspectives. And unfortunately, I feel DI work has been tarnished with this sort of woke agenda. It's absolutely not about that. And done in the right way, it enhances fairness and inclusion. Disengagement. I think some cynical people would say there are lots of commitments companies put out, particularly in 2020 and 2021, especially around race. But actually, 4, 5, 6 years on, have those commitments been kept up, and therefore people disengage or have some cynicism. A lot of challenges around inclusion exist early and outside of the workplace. So whilst I think it's critical that organisations create really inclusive environments, we can't change what's happened around society. Structural inequality, particularly around social mobility, happens way before people enter the workplace. So sometimes that can really slow down impact. And then lastly, fatigue. I think one of the really important areas of inclusion work is having employee resource groups. But actually, employee resource groups are more than likely led by people from a less represented group who may already be challenged on how they navigate the workplace. They're not always funded. It can require a lot of emotional labour to run an ERG. And actually, what we notice, and we've noticed it ourselves, that some ERGs get really burnt out because you're putting the work on people who are already potentially navigating non-inclusive cultures, who already have to navigate challenges in the external world. And we're asking them to do even more work to educate us all around inclusion. So I always think it's a good practice to make sure everybody's actively included in ERGs. They're well funded and they're well resourced. So future trends, again, I feel like the case for inclusion has never been stronger, even in a world where we see some companies stepping back. For example, Gen Z. Gen Z will become the biggest demographic in the workplace by 2030. They'll make up nearly 30% of the workplace. Gen Z, however, unfortunately, because this is the generation that's always grown up with social media, have significant mental health challenges compared to other generations. Now, some of that is they are more willing to talk about mental health. They're more educated and informed on the topic. But other factors like always growing up through with social media, being educated through the COVID pandemic, at whatever age a Gen Z might have been at university, they might have been at school. Obviously, during the pandemic, people experienced significant social isolation. If you're middle-aged like me, that was quite lovely. But if you're younger and you socialise, then actually it did have quite a significant impact on people's mental health. Menopausal women are the fastest growing workplace demographic. There are currently nearly 1 billion menopausal women in the workplace, and yet 90% of companies put no support in place for women transitioning through menopause. How we see the world of work, it shows a real difference by generation. Millennials, Gen Z see very different perspectives with the contract with work. They're far less likely to be company loyal compared to Gen Xers and baby boomers. There's greater neurodiversity or people with neurodivergent conditions. I would like to very much stress this isn't about it being a growing phenomena. This is purely down to increased diagnostics and better diagnostics. But for example, we've seen nearly an 800% increase in people in the UK being diagnosed with ADHD. Actually, particularly people at middle age, as they notice when their children potentially get diagnosed at school age. So we need to be far more inclusive to a greater awareness around neurodiversity and also the added advantages and benefits neurodivergent people bring. And then lastly, sadly, we all know we'll be working for longer, but actually that brings greater age diversity into the workplace, but also more disability diversity, as most people tend to acquire a disability. It is a bit of a myth that people are born with disability. Actually, 80% of people acquire disability at some point during their lifetime. And as we work longer, the prevalence of disability tends to increase as well. So we need to be far more disability inclusive as well. So how to address D&I fatigue? There's no silver bullet. These are my sort of top 5 tips. So firstly, and some of it is where I think some companies have gone a bit wrong, and the companies that were early to quit probably didn't have the most embedded approach around DEI. So firstly, you need to embed it in all your practices, in your culture. If you remember, one of my quotes was, build it in, don't bolt it on. When I started working in the place, I used to get told, how do we hire more diverse people? And I would say, well, you need to have the most inclusive recruitment practice. I can't add that on to a process, right? That has to be the process. You need to make it everybody's job. What we notice, for example, through our ERG groups is our audience are far more likely to be female, broadly younger, and also from a non-white ethnicity group. And actually, we're like, this is for everybody. Some people don't even think that they can attend ERG sessions, but actually, when it's part of everybody's role, when everybody safeguards inclusion in the culture, you have far more impact. When the responsibility of DEI sits with few people and not everybody, you only get limited traction. And I'd really extend it out that the most important thing you need is a CEO who really backs and advocates for this work. Without that, you'll just be sort of doing performative D&I around the edges. You need to continue to communicate the competitive advantage of this. The business case has to be key to any D&I strategy being fully utilised and embedded. And consider D&I through the lens of future skills to your business as well. How not only does it give you advantage today in terms of innovation, teamwork, employee retention, but it'll give you even more advantage in the future as the workplace gets more and more representatively diverse, more global. The role of AI comes into how we work, and arguably what do humans do versus AI. The business case for D&I will only strengthen. Put inclusion at the heart of hybrid working. I think for many, hybrid working has been a real positive because it's enabled particularly neurodivergent people, possibly people with caregiving responsibilities or people with disabilities, much more flexibility. We are now seeing a bit more of a call back into the office. So what I would say is make sure that hybrid working is fully inclusive. Otherwise, we'll end up with systems where you get the in-office people getting more privilege, more recognition, benefiting from a sort of a greater visibility that enhances their career, and people who work from home or people who have flexible working being left behind. And then lastly, have long-term sustainable goals. I think some of the criticism, which would be fair of DEI, is it measures it through the lens of certain characteristics, typically gender and ethnicity, and it measures it in a really short-term way, and therefore drives short-term actions for long-term cultural, systemic opportunities and challenges. So when we look at diversity goals, we will only set long-term goals. They will be stretching enough for us to change what we do. I'm a believer, set a stretching goal you might not achieve rather than a sort of moderate goal you'll achieve, because you'll probably just do the same things. But it's okay to not achieve a stretching long-term goal. What's really important is, did we take meaningful action? Did we strive to be better and more inclusive? So I'll talk a bit about the role of AI. I'm sure none of us can avoid conversations about AI and what does that mean. Is it going to benefit us from an inclusion perspective? I think there's an unclear answer on this. I can see positives and I can see negatives. AI can be really helpful for flagging bias, absolutely. You can put any document. I did it myself with year-end performance reviews. I said, just check, are there any biases? Does the rating I've given align with the verbatim? It can absolutely improve accessibility particularly for neurodivergent or disabled people, because it gives us much more technology. It can really help us, not be required, or we can use our voice recognition far more. It can check for errors in a way that really helps people. It can support our work-life balance if we sign up to the view that it takes the mundane, boring work away and it leaves us just focused on really impactful, purposeful work. It can create human-centric workplaces, right? So if the admin routine, things that we don't like doing, and if it makes us 20% more productive, what do we use that 20% of our time for? Are we going to invest in relationships, networking, strategic thinking, building stronger partnerships, really delving deeper into problem solving? But of course, all of that requires us to be more inclusive as leaders. It requires us to be empathetic. It requires us to be inclusive. Those are things that AI can't do. However, there are some call-outs or negatives. Firstly, anything based on historical data, you need to be incredibly careful because it will be littered with biases, inequities. Today's society doesn't mirror a society of 10 years ago or 20 years ago, where some data from AI comes from. It could make our brains really lazy, right? We've probably all been a little bit guilty of that. But if we don't lean into work, sometimes we learn by getting really stuck into a problem, by really sort of building up a data set, really understanding. And we've seen this start to come through where there's been research around students who use AI for dissertations and those that don't. The AI dissertations are better, but the lack of or the retained knowledge of students who use AI at university tends to be significantly less than those that don't. So it could make us quite lazy as human beings and not really getting a deep understanding of topics. And if we become too reliant on AI, and believe me, AI is not always accurate, then actually there's potentially concern that we can make bigger mistakes. Not everybody likes strategic, innovation, creative work. So the things that AI can't do, some people really love actually routine, systematic, detail-orientated work. So we shouldn't assume that everybody sees the benefit. The technology sector that sort of governs AI is probably the least representative. Less than 1 in 5 people who work in technology, for example, are women. And yet we're going to rely on systems produced from perhaps not the most representative workforce or job sector. And AI is very good at logic, analysing, but it really isn't very good at emotion. So we need to be cognizant of the positives and the negatives of AI. Okay, sorry, my slides are looking a little, right, sorry, bear with me. Okay, I think I'm back on that slide, so hopefully. So just to round up from today's discussion, I wanted to just share some of the things that I've really learned and would recommend. So firstly, treat everything as data. I love data. Numerical data is fantastic. It really helps influence senior leaders. Most senior leaders come from a finance, economic background, but also don't ignore insight. The stories people tell you about how inclusive your culture is another really good pulse check. Measure, measure, measure. We can really demonstrate, I think, particularly as the business case is challenged, the better your data, the easier it is to measure and demonstrate impact and ROI, which really helps bake D&I work into the longer term structure and organizational success. You can close gaps the right and the wrong way, as I mentioned. Trying to change the outcome of a non-inclusive process is not very valuable. If anything, it can actually be negative because people are perceived to have not earned their role or their position. But having the most inclusive practice, so you hire the best person for the job and hire in the most inclusive way. Representation, therefore, is only an outcome of a good practice rather than it being perceived as unfair or targeting certain groups. You must bring leaders along on the journey. You'll only go so far if you don't have engagement at the very top who are willing to role model and really advocate for this work. Create different approaches based on personas, potentially by geography. We're a global organisation. There is some work we do in some regions that we couldn't do in other regions. And then, of course, always come back to the business impact of this work. It really future-proofs DEI work. So what's going to happen from 2026 and beyond? Just a few of my thoughts. I think we'll hear more about inclusion, empathy, curiosity. I think company purpose, psychological safety and belonging will become real focus areas. Companies will talk about being inclusive and accessible in all they do. We're still navigating it, but I think the role of AI, and I think once we start to understand what AI does, where AI works alongside people, it'll really elevate opportunities for us to think more inclusively. Integrating inclusion and well-being, it's really critical. Well-being is so much better served when it's seen through the lens and the benefits of inclusion. And social mobility, I think a lot of companies have really focused on gender and ethnicity, but actually social mobility tends to be the thread that underpins a lot of exclusion and lack of fairness in the workplace. So that's all my presentation. Put a quick QR code. I am on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. If you're like me and you think of a question after today's presentation, by all means, please feel free to reach out. I think, Tracy, I can see you back on screen. I think we might have time for a few questions as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. That was really great. Lots of things to think about, I think. A couple of questions, please. People are in different places with their maturity on DEI. What have you noticed makes the biggest difference?
Oh, that's a great question. I would probably say two things: your ability to get data, your ability to influence your CEO. Once your CEO really starts advocating for this work, very lucky, Tracy, you and I both work for a CEO who absolutely does, and has an unwavering commitment and is willing to give time and dedication and be at the forefront. That absolutely makes a huge difference, particularly at the start. I think longer term, you then want to think about how do you engage a wider leadership community, because if you rely too long on the CEO forever, then you start to get the questions about, well, we see they're bought in, but what about their leadership team? But I think if you're certainly in your early phase, I'd really think about how you get CEO engagement and how you try and measure things together. Like really look at the diverse impact or representation impact for your practices or your processes, employee engagement, employee representation. I used to just try and look at anything that was a data point and almost bring them all together. And then talk to leadership, because leaders typically like data. I've had much more success talking about data or talking with data to leaders than I've just sort of talking hypothetically about inclusion. It tends not to gravitate in the same way.
Okay, great. And what impact will AI have on our ways of working, and will it help or hinder DEI, do you think?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned in that slide, we don't know yet. I think you can argue it either way. What I hope is we really find our routine around AI. I don't know if it's the same in everybody's company, but I sometimes see as, oh, AI can do that. Well, what can AI do? And it's good, but I also think we need to really find how we work in partnership with AI. So I'll give you an example. When I did my year-end performance reviews with my team, as I mentioned, I used AI to check, did it feel fair? Did it feel concise? Did it feel unbiased? Did it align with the rating that I'd given that person? But I actually genuinely wrote people's performance reviews myself. I just used AI at the end. No, actually, I think we all know I could have typed a few keywords or I could have verbally said something and it would have written it for me. But really, how am I serving people well as a manager if I'm not going to give it care and attention and not really think about the message I'm trying to craft to people in my team? So I think we just really need to think and be a bit cautious around AI. One of my big concerns is we over rely on AI. We think it's 100% accurate when it's not, and we don't lean into learning. Particularly as I have a young child, I don't want them to ever sort of just do the lazy AI. You know, I'm sure we can all remember when we were at school, we all thought, what's the point of learning mental arithmetic because we've got a calculator? But actually, it helps you. It helps you spot problems. It helps that part of your brain, which is like any other muscle, stay active. And that's really important for us, not just as how we learn, but also us as human beings for our own health and well-being. The brain is just like any other muscle. If we don't use it, then it doesn't really develop, or it doesn't sort of expand or grow or help us.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Jo. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for taking the time out. Thanks so much, Jo. It was really interesting. Great presentation. Can tell you're really passionate about it.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.